All right, so we are recording, and the floor is yours, James.
Thank you, Court. Okay, I'm just gonna read a paper. I'm gonna start with a epigraph from Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. Look, a Negro, Mama, a Negro. Shh, you'll make him angry. Don't pay attention to him, monsieur. He doesn't realize you're just as civilized as we are. This paper has been born of frustration, disillusionment, and a persistent but faltering effort to ward off cynicism about the prospects of peace. After having spent over a decade working in grassroots peace-building efforts in a former conflict region, and experiencing the sense in which that region, according to the testimony of its own people, is sliding back towards the sort of overt violence that had decimated it for decades. Community-based grassroots efforts at peace building, attempts to truly address the conditions that create fertile ground for the sowing of the seeds of violence, continually meet the twin barriers of neo-colonial Western aid and development institutions and their policies, and Western indifference to the suffering of those who can be easily screened off from view as the peace and prosperity of the West continues to be built upon their very backs. The forces of white Euro-American patriarchal coloniality continue to leave these communities silenced and disempowered, divorced from being able to get their hands upon the resources and levers necessary to transform their world in a way that would open a space for a sustained positive peace. It's undeniable to me that the fundamental force of war and violence, both globally and within the US, is rooted in the persistent incapacity to dismantle and shake the hegemonic grip of the Western logic of domination and subjugation that has exploited, marginalized, disempowered, and subjected to tremendous amounts of violence, millions upon millions of people for centuries. We still don't hear the words of king. We've yet to develop tools, methods, and counter ideologies for dismantling this logic at its core. Adding to this frustration is also the sense in which the same structures of Western coloniality are operative in shaping peace-building analyses, diagnoses, and engagement inside both the academic discipline of peace studies and also within many institutions and organizations committed by mission to the peace-building process. The common trend in such circles is to focus upon the more local, regional powers and how they must be brought to accountability, or in more positive terms, how they must be put in a position to hear and appreciate through some process of mediation or communion the needs of their fellow humans that have been suffering not only through overt acts of violence, but from privation and other manifest forms of structural violence, quote, under their rule, unquote. All of this simply seems to miss the looming white elephant in the room, the very institutional structures and logics that these peace workers are often themselves the beneficiary of. Seldom do we find within such circles earnest work towards goals that would ultimately serve to focus and harness the power of marginalized and oppressed communities, so as to be able to force structural changes to the very hierarchical order that, without irony, provides many working within peace-building networks that privilege and capital to engage in their quote-unquote noble missionary work. My disillusionment, unfortunately, has found little solace in turning to the domain bearing the noble name of peace and conflict studies, at least not the more forward-facing and heralded face of that discipline. To find leading anthologies and introductory texts from major academic publishers proclaiming things like the following was thoroughly disheartening. Quote, attitudes towards war and violence in Europe and North America steadily evolved across the following decades, until in the 21st century, a majority of people in these and many other regions prefer that conflicts be settled through negotiation rather than through violence, end quote. According to this author, and here I paraphrase, The noble and civilized attitudes toward war and violence that have developed in the West then appear to have slowly begun the process of spreading into other, should we say darker, portions of the globe, where the wretched of the earth apparently hungrily lap up this Western wisdom. Kipling would be proud for sure. I could go on, but my point here isn't to condemn a tradition or pass judgment upon an entire discipline. My sole point thus far is to vocalize the sense of frustration, maybe bitterness, that's been building in me in the face of seeing, and indeed in being quite intimately involved with, quite palpable failures of the institutions and systems that supposedly are committed to something as important as peace building and conflict resolution. And I'm becoming increasingly frustrated with what appears to be a common and persistent incapacity of so many institutions and landmark studies of violence and peace to offer a more in-depth and ultimately cognizant analysis of peace and conflict in the real world. I can't help thinking there must be something deeper, something more trenchant in its analyses and prescriptions, less devoted to the secular God of Western white patriarchal wisdom and civilization. I wanted to find something more radical. In his Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, W.E.B. Du Bois raises the following question. But is it not education that is the creator of this freedom and equality for which we long? Du Bois answers his own question with the following. Most men today cannot conceive of a freedom that does not involve somebody's slavery. Often and understandably so, one of the first questions that naturally arises within the discipline of peace studies is as to its goal. We know the goal by name, peace, but what more is this thing that we hope to achieve? Of course, here's the point at which the negative peace, positive peace distinction is often considered useful and thus tends to become articulated. I assume all are familiar with that distinction, so I'll not dive into it any deeper here. But still, despite this distinction, we're left hungry for more, since it seems quite reasonable to believe that justifiably prescribing certain actions as appropriate or not on the road to this sought-for peace would presuppose some more robust understanding of where it is we're attempting to get to. What indeed is the nature of peace itself? More troubling to me, though, is the following. What, if any, articulation of this positive notion of the goal of peace work, even minimally so, is inextricably laden with violence and injustice? To put it another way, what if the very conceptual framework through which the goal of peace studies is formulated is itself a framework of violence and oppression? What if the only states of justice and peace, or freedom to use Du Bois' phrasing, that many of us are capable of articulating to ourselves and to others are ones that themselves are fundamentally structured and conditioned by various deep and persistent manifestations of violence? What then are we to think of the very analyses and prescriptions that rest upon this framework and which are taken as the bread and butter of the discipline of peace studies? What we take to be justice, or even an overcoming of more covert and ingrained structures of violence and oppression itself, or more simply, even our understanding of the very nature of those structures must be conceived from somewhere. And that somewhere is a position within structures of violence and injustice, from within the hierarchical world order that we may wish to, but ultimately cannot escape. Isn't it obvious that our very manners of conceiving of the goal of peace processes and peace work will be conditioned by our position within hierarchies of power and violence, such that from positions of domination and privilege, the analyses and prescriptions given will bear this taint? This point seems to me well captured by James Baldwin in his characterization of a legal courtroom in his work, The Evidence of Things Not Seen. Quote, each of us knows, though we do not like this knowledge, that a courtroom is a visceral Roman circus. No one involved in this contest is or can be impartial. One makes the attempt, or imagine that one does, but it is in any case and strenuously an attempt. Or in other words, the ability to suspend judgment is in each of us suspect. To leave it at that, without, that is, going so far as to say that the suspension of judgment is impossible. For to suspend judgment demands that one dismiss one's perceptions at the very same moment that one is crucially and cruelly dependent upon them. We perceive by means of the kaleidoscopic mirror of this life. End quote. What we see is no more than a distorted and jumbled reflection of ourselves and our position within the hierarchical power structures that are operative in the world. The question that is salient then is not how to articulate something that avoids the problem of partiality and the conditioned nature of our perceptions, conceptualizations, and judgment, but rather to understand how to proceed in light of our inability to do so. Any notion that can be formulated of freedom or justice, which seem to be key components of any notion of peace in the positive sense, trades heavily upon conceptions of the human. But so too are such notions the stock and trade of violent and oppressive ideologies and logics that form the conceptual frameworks through which we have any access to the social world that we inhabit. Indeed, to conceive of the human, and thus all derivative notions such as desert and justice and peace itself, will engage all the deep structures that we have absorbed from the world that we inhabit, including the manners of delimiting such a conception and placing it in opposition to its corresponding notion of the other. Phrased in terms of the operative force of ideologies upon our capacity to see, and thus our capacity to engage in reflection upon and determinations of courses of actions within, is put nicely by Barbara Fields. Quote, ideology is best understood as the descriptive vocabulary of day-to-day existence, through which people make rough sense of the social reality that they live and create from day to day. It is the language of consciousness that suits the particular way in which people deal with their fellows. It is the interpretation in thought of the social relations through which they constantly create and recreate their collective being in all the varied forms their collective being may assume. As such, ideologies are not delusions, but real as the social relations for which they stand. End quote. A fundamental element of both decolonial thinking, as well as the Black radical tradition, is a recognition of the extent to which our gaze is laden with concepts and structures that derive from the paradigms of power within which we are embedded. Moreover, these traditions have also pulled back the veil upon the quote unquote darker side of the Western tradition by providing witness to the myriad ways in which the logic of this Western tradition is laden with dehumanizing structures that have been operative in the oppression of so many. The very essence of coloniality, racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, etc., the core of those conceptual structures that must be purged if there is any hope of peace is the specific manners in which they objectify and dehumanize subjects. What should bother all of us is the fact that such coloniality is still the dominant structure underlying much of academia and the international sector tasked with peace building. Sylvia Wynter, in her A Black Studies Manifesto, pulls no punches in capturing this. Quote, to conclude, we cannot as a population of African descent, wholly or partially, expect any other result but our continued degradation and global disempowerment within the terms of our present conception of the human, man, and the order of knowledge by means of which this conception is elaborated. As the other to this conception of the human, the cultural messages of the order of knowledge which elaborates this conception must by necessity be hostile, not only to our realization, but to our survival as a population group. It is it or us. End quote. The immediate issue then seems to be one of how to resist the inevitable grasp of these dehumanizing structures. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin says the following, quote, "They do not know Harlem, and I do. So do you. Take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your experience. Know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there's really no limit to where you can go. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies behind the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people, and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously." End quote. Baldwin often speaks about what it means to, quote unquote, survive as an individual subjugated to an unrelenting storm of structures meant to deny your humanity. Here we may find an entryway to understanding how to resist structures of dehumanization, which can then provide some orientation, not only at the concrete level of the lived reality of marginalized bodies, but also for the disciplines concerned to see such processes blossom. He says that lack of survival is, quite simply, to come to believe in what those dehumanizing structures are bent upon telling you that you are. In other words, to accept the dehumanization is to be destroyed and lose the struggle to survive. The alternative, according to Baldwin, is to resist. The alternative is to assert one's humanity in the face of such structures. Now, this, in and of itself, does not provide any positive conception of the human. Indeed, to do that would be to transfer the violence of exclusion to someone else, to another other. Nonetheless, this act of assertion, an act which is a resistance, posits itself against the structures within which one is embedded. It refuses, to put it quite simply. So much of the conflict in the world, so much of the violence ultimately comes down to dehumanizing power structures and their consequences. The essence of peace work, if there is any such thing, is to deconstruct and ultimately replace such structures. But that work begins with assertions of humanity within the vice grip of such structures. There's no right way or wrong way to do this. There's no goal or end point. For humanity can have no such thing without thereby denying some portion of itself. To define such an endpoint is to encase and enclose, and the whole point is not to do that. For it is such enclosures that constitute the violence. So there must be resistance and struggle from within those very identities that are oppressed and subjected to persistent dehumanization. For if the essence of dislodging the dehumanizing power structures at the root of violence and oppression is located in resistance in the face of such structures, this cannot be an act from a hegemonic position within those structures. For the point is that in the assertion, in the very act of resisting and refusing, the subject posits themselves as subject, as refusing to be less than human. What would it mean, for example, for a white man such as I am to do that? To declare triumphantly in defiance that I am human and that I resist those structures that say otherwise? It means nothing, or worse, it indeed cements those very structures we need to dislodge. Power must be found, it must be asserted, it must be created in the margins, in the periphery, that as marginal is the result of the very process it pushes back against. The question is how to open such spaces for resistance, how to provide an arena for such experiments with being and self. Therein will be the creation of power sources. As individuals craft resistance, as they assert their humanity, not only is that very act a radical act, a revolutionary act, but such individual acts generate a collective force, a power, that pushes the combining structures back, thus opening even more space for further creation and further experimentation, for more humanity. This is a process not of discovery. This is not a process of reclamation. It is a process of creation. Indeed, what we may see is the most intimate and undefined element of the human spirit, to be without being defined. In her essay, Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness, Bell Hooks says the following, quote, "When asked what does it mean to enjoy reading Beloved, to admire school days, and have a theoretical interest in post-structuralist theory, I located my answer concretely in the realm of oppositional political struggle. Such diverse pleasures can be experienced, enjoyed even, because one transgresses, moves out of one's place. For many of us, that movement requires pushing against oppressive boundaries set by race, sex, and class domination. Initially, then, it is a defiant political gesture. Moving, we confront the realities of choice and location. Within complex and ever-shifting realms of power relations, do we position ourselves on the side of colonizing mentality? Or do we continue to stand in political resistance with the oppressed, ready to offer our ways of seeing and theorizing, of making culture, towards that revolutionary effort which seeks to create space where there is unlimited access to the pleasure and power of knowing, where transformation is possible? The choice is crucial. It shapes and determines our response to existing cultural practice and our capacity to envision new, alternative, oppositional, aesthetic acts. It informs the way we speak about these issues, the language we choose. Language is also a place of struggle." End quote. It's not about sitting down with oppressors and oppressed alike, bringing them to the table so that dialogue can happen. For the bottom line is that so long as those dialogues, those tables and the rooms that house them are structured by hegemonic and dehumanizing power structures, there is no dialogue to be had. There is no, quote, fellow humanity, end quote, to unify and build upon. We simply don't have the wisdom of what that means. We are not at the stage of being able to have such conversations and such a coming together. What we need is resistance, a refusal to integrate into the hegemonic Western spaces, institutions, structures, ideologies, concepts, etc., that must be deconstructed if there is to be any chance for something worthy of the name peace. And such deconstruction presupposes the generation of force from groups that have asserted, in the face of that oppression, their very humanity. This requires that those populations lead. It requires that hegemonic populations be utilized as tools, not as the end state. No, this is not about reversal, but such a move is a means to creating a condition whereby someday somebody, maybe our children, can finally sit down and build a more beautiful humanity. We are not there.
James.
We still need resistance. Have one paragraph?
Okay, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Perfect. How do we foster and empower spaces of resistance in the face of dehumanization? This is the only question that matters for a discipline concerned with peace and liberation, so far as I'm concerned. People have been subjected to persistent attempts to dehumanize them. Communities that have been relegated to the margins must be given the space to articulate their own visions, to harness their own power. Only then will that power have the capacity to dislodge the hegemonic powers that be. Indeed, everything rests upon this. Maya Angelou captures this very sense of resistance so beautifully. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I didn't want to interrupt because it was really good, and also it looks like we're going to have some extra time anyway. So I'm glad you were able to finish there. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any questions? I mean, we've got a small enough group. If somebody has a question, Meredith typed one in that says, what if you replace the word peace with justice? Does that change your analysis any?
Yeah, I don't think it does ultimately. And I left out some of the details of when you get into the permutations of negative peace versus positive peace. An issue of justice often arises as something more contentful that has to be in place for the achievement of that positive peace. But I don't see it really changes anything. You still, a conception of justice still requires some conception of relationships between persons and a conception of humanity. And I think that's precisely the point with Du Bois, that even going to the sense of freedom, we really don't know what that means. We really don't know what justice means.
All right, Anna, you have a question? Well, actually, Andy was first, so.
I'm happy to let Anna go. Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you. I was just wondering if particularly in the work that you've done, if you've seen opportunities for drawing on and building on local traditions, or finding, new opportunities to build peace in particular contexts. I'm just thinking of this because I work with Dogon communities in central Mali, and unfortunately there are now a lot of intercommunal conflicts going on there right now. But at the same time, there are some pretty interesting resources within Dogon traditions for conflict resolution and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you see any possibilities for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would hope that there could be, in my work, I think part of the struggle, I've worked extensively in northern Uganda. And part of the struggle that arises is the sort of situatedness, if you will, within which those communities are forced to try to utilize their practices and their structures. And the problem is when there are such immediate material needs and physical needs that it becomes a case where those communities are forced to try to make the moves to play into those larger, as I call them, dehumanizing structures. They have to play the game, so to speak, to try to get healthcare, to try to get capital, to try to get, and that in some sense, I think, subverts the ability of those practices to really be used to their fullest, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
And in Uganda, specifically in northern Uganda, this issue has arisen because, with the ending of the civil war there around 2006, 2008, the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Coyne, who most of us have heard of, the international community's involvement was to bring charges against Coyne at the level of the International Criminal Court. And this was very problematic because on the one hand, it really shut down the capacity of local communities to use their own processes of resolution. And so again, it was sort of like trying to operate in that. They really had the doors closed to them to be able to utilize them. And part of what I want to sort of play with in this paper is, this idea that, and you hear it a lot today, of coming to the table, oppressors and oppressed sitting down and having conversation, doesn't work if the populations that have been in marginalized positions are never able to sort of enact their own humanity, or never able to generate their own power. They're coming in without, to use Kwame Ture's language, without any bargaining power, and so that doesn't become a dialogue. And I think that kind of relates to your question a little bit.
Andy?
Yeah, James, take this. I love the way that you wove these texts together to make your point. Thank you so much. It was just brilliant how you brought all of this in. Really got me thinking. two questions. One is, what does the resistance look like? So I'm just wondering about, is it nonviolent resistance? It sounded often it's deconstruction. It's kind of an intellectual work, but so what does it look like? And then a harder question that I just was, as you're saying all these things that really like resonate, I'm thinking the Trump supporters have been saying similar things about themselves, claiming that they are oppressed, that they have been marginalized. In fact, Trump himself, all these accusations against the establishment, drain the swamp, fake news, etc. The discourse has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. What do we do with that? Where the folks who are, in my estimation, the oppressors are themselves claiming now that they're subject to oppression and they're viewing themselves as marginalized. And how do we sort that out?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. It really, I think, good questions. To the first one, you say, what does the resistance look like? And in some sense, this is meant to be an opening to begin that, really a deep consideration of that. And to start that, the first thing to flag is, I don't consider myself would be in the position to be the one able to craft those, right? This is where it has to be coming from marginalized communities. I would view my task as more as what do we have to do to create the spaces for them to develop those resistive practices. On the other hand, in reading through a lot of the Black radical tradition and looking at the things that are formulated, that are utilized to try to do this, it varies from historical revisionism, having a space to recreate the narratives of history in ways that don't write out or marginalize populations. So much of the Black radical tradition, you see these works by people like Vincent Harding that really go back and say, look, we have to, to use King's language, where do we go from here? We have to know where we came from and where we are. And that requires going back and reworking the histories and changing them. It requires structural analyses for the kind of work I was doing at the level of healthcare work on the ground in northern Uganda, real structural critiques on the sort of models and systems that are being utilized in communities. And again, I think a lot of this has to come from those communities, ways of crafting, pushing back against various models, of not playing into, for instance, the Western nonprofit sector, which is going to continue to, in my experience, is going to continue to sort of subjugate those communities, even with benevolent intentions, but learning ways to push back and work outside of those traditions. So, I think a little bit, and I can speak more about ideas of resistance, but that's the way I'm sort of thinking of it in those senses. Now, in terms of the Trump supporters, I was thinking about this as well, right? You're going to get this same sort of rhetoric that's what they're doing. They are radically resisting their own oppression. And 2 points that I think are important recognizing there. And one, again, I go to Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton and their landmark work, Black Power. They consider, this kind of claim, like, can't somebody, they're promoting Black power, they're rejecting white power, and can't somebody for white power say you're doing the same thing? These are symmetrical movements. You're doing it in the name of Blackness, we're doing it in the name of whiteness, but they're really the same. We just disagree about. And their answer to it is no, it's not the same, right? Because what matters is the actual lived structural hierarchies you're functioning within. And the fact of the matter is, in the United States, we have a white power structure where whiteness has been elevated in power and hegemony over non-white populations. And so to push in favor of those things is not a resistive effort at all. It is not resistance. It is an effort to ingrain the very structures that have been there, and it's an effort to continue subjugation. Well, their claim is Black power. Its goal is what matters. It's not an attempt to subjugate. It's an attempt to liberate oneself from a position of being subjugated. And that makes all the difference in the world. Does that mean that some of these populations we're seeing support Trump aren't in some way or another oppressed? No, of course not. But there's a misanalysis of how they are being oppressed, and this is where in the Black radical tradition is that we have to open up, and this was King as well, we have to open up a looking at the economic systems and looking at how poverty is a shared feature of oppression across racial divides, and that white people can be oppressed for sure, but it is not in virtue of their whiteness. They can be oppressed because they are marginalized economically, they are marginalized by capitalistic processes that reduce them to. So I think all that has to be brought in, that it can't really be used in the way by Trump supporters that would be worrisome.
All right. Thank you, James. We're going to stop there because I'm going to make sure we have plenty of time for our next speaker. And if our other Solomon shows up, for him to have time too. So there are some questions in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we can do some more. So next up is Lu Jiang to talk about Karl Jasper's existential humanism and its impact for world peace.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have made some slides for this purpose, and I am now sharing my screen with you. You can. I have a notice that there is a forbidden. So maybe can.
Yeah, you should be able to do it now.
Oh yeah, thanks. I try again. Yeah, that's all right. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Thanks. I'm going to talk about Karl Jaspers because I think that his philosophy of humanism, and especially this existential humanism, can use as a very actual counterbalance to what we have now. That is to contradict all the cultures and civilizations in the world. As I see in the world politics now, I see that there is a tendency that countries and the different powers are asked to form in lines on the one part and on the other part. So we are actually in the danger of a new Cold War, and that is my initiation of why I'm going to talk about this. So I will start with more theoretical foundations, and then I move to my first slide. This one is thinking about what is civilization, and how does this notion comes into a paradigm for research of politics and global politics especially. I traced the tradition back to the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, and he's talking about national societies were first developed in human history. However, national societies will be replaced by an international society, which is what we call globalization. And globalization there are different degrees of globalization. I don't think that our era is special for the globalization. Actually, in the human history, we have already had, always had this globalization. The problem is that we have different degrees of globalizations. Human beings move from different parts to on this earth, and information, knowledge are transmitted from one part of the world to the other. People intermarriage. So therefore, globalization is not a special phenomenon for our modern society. However, we see that the national boundaries are tighter earlier, but now the states, we still have national states, but national states are more interwoven today by economics, culture exchanges, and also there are quite a lot more intermarriage and immigration. So that this phenomenon is captured by Durkheim, and he proposed with his colleague Mauss a new concept as an addition to our traditional concept for the sociologic analysis, which is society and the national state, but he introduced the new concept of civilization. So I will generally, I will enunciate some kind of these characteristics made by Durkheim and Mauss about civilization. Civilization differs from states, nations, and other political formations, as a civilization have symbolic boundaries. As mentioned before, language, mentalities, some kind of let's say also literature, as it is bonds the Greek polis together. That is Homer. So they have symbolic boundaries, and civilization also interacts and interpenetrates with society. So every civilization is also susceptible to nationalization. Civilization are also less clearly defined groups, which do have individuality and are the seeds of a new sort of social life. As for Durkheim, civilizations constitute a kind of moral milieu, and they are complex and interdependent systems, which without being limited to a determinate political order and a political organism. However, they are localizable in time and space. And I think that all these features are somehow also enumerated in the previous talk by James. And so I move on to the elements of civilization analysis, which are more concrete and not in these abstract concepts. We have a religion and also economy, language, art, and science, which this list is made by Sweetberg in an article in 2010. So we have let's have a look at Western civilization, because Western civilization has been the dominant civilization in the world and has pushed on the globalization for the past 400 years. This is a historical fact which we cannot deny, but we have to reflect on this historical event and phenomenon. So for the Western population or Western countries, they made history courses for their children, for their population, and there is a prevalent narration of Western civilization. I can find this kind of narration very frequently also in the books I use for the course on the history of Western philosophy. So the narration always begins from Greek and Greece, then adding the Palestine because of Western Christianity, and then move on to the modern West. So the people in the West see them as descendants of the ancient Greece and also Roman Empire. And Western people see their civilization as originates in the classical world. However, there is a problem because this kind of self-understanding is not quite compatible with the self-identification today. For example, the Byzantium, I think the Orthodox Christianity, which is not always included in the Western in the West, it is belongs to Russia, represented by Russia. However, not everybody in the West will accept Russia as one member of the West, especially in Europe. I have heard from a French colleague. He's speaking that Russia doesn't belong to Europe. And then if the West has a narration of their civilization as originating in the classical world, then how about Islam? Because the Arabic culture also has a Greek heritage. They have Aristotle, and they even had the whole Aristotle corpus earlier than the Western Latin civilization. So there is always a problem with this narration and then our political self-identification today. These problems will be dealt with by Huntington in his theory in the Clash of Civilizations. And I think that as a Chinese, I think that people in America are more familiar with this writings. So I'm not going to dwell too long on this. As I read Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, which was published in 1996, and then look to our situation today, you must say that Huntington has made a very subtle analysis of the world politics. And he has based also his analysis on some very detailed empirical researches and statistics. However, there is a deeper core and frame of his theory, which is not empirical. He's influenced by Durkheim, Brodel, and Toynbee's concept of civilization, which is philosophical and not empirical. Let's look at Huntington's 7 major civilizations. He enumerated 7 major civilizations and include actually a lot of non-Western civilizations. One is Cynic, that's my culture, and Japanese, Hindu, Islamic, Latin American, Western, Latin American, and African. However, he is opposed to 19th century universalism. This kind of universalism has pushed forward the globalization of Western cultures and Western values. But to Huntington, as he is, I think he is a clear-head analysis. He has seen that even in the 90s, even 25 years ago, the influence is the economical influence of West was not as strong and powerful as in the 19th century. The West has met a lot of rivals, especially from East Asia, which was pointed out by Huntington already in his book. So he has declined to. He doesn't. He's not confined. He said he's rejecting this kind of universalism as promoted in the 19th century. So he says that the ideology of the West, this kind of universalism is the ideology of the West for confrontations with non-Western cultures. This way is not practicable anymore. So what will he propose to do for the Western countries? His thought about the emergence of an universal civilization can be summarized in the following arguments. Because we are not going to have a universal civilization despite the aeroplanes and all this convenience of international travel and also the movements of immigration. Because he has used this argument, which is plausible, as I think. Although the Cold War is over, however, ethnicities, religions, and civilizations are still source of conflicts, which we can see it is true now. everywhere in the world, we see that religions are generating conflicts and ethnicities, of course. So economics interdependence foster peace. That is true in a sense only when states expect that high trade levels will continue into the foreseeable future. But if we look at it today, we can see that some states are not going to there are some of the Western states, they are not going to continue this interdependence of economical exchanges and trade. We see that the isolations in the trade are coming back into our global world. So I think that Huntington's analysis is quite precise if we look at our situation today. And of course, people's self-identification functions by reference to otherness. People identify himself by what he is not. So as I quote Huntington, in an increasingly globalized world, characterized by historically exceptional degrees of civilizational, societal, and other modes of interdependence and widespread consciousness thereof, there is an exacerbation of civilizational, societal, and ethnic self-consciousness. The enhanced communication doesn't erase these kind of groupings and particular self-identifications. Instead, it enhanced all this kind of self-identification by otherness. So I move on to the second slide, and I quote Huntington in this passage. In addition to our national states, which was actors in the global politics, we have new formations, which is a civilization. So spurred by modernization, global politics is being reconfigured along cultural lines. Peoples and countries with similar cultures are coming together. We see that political groups are forming together using words like values. Western fraction are grouping together by referring to a certain group of Western values. So peoples and countries with different cultures are coming apart. Alignments defined by ideology and superpower relations are giving way to alignments defined by culture and civilization. Political boundaries increasingly are redrawn to coincide with cultural ones, ethnic, religious, and civilizational. Cultural communities are replacing Cold War blocks, and the fault line between civilizations are becoming the central lines of conflict in global politics. I think this is familiar to almost everyone, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. But he has made some prognosis of the future, which is the present for us. That is a regrouping of powers in global politics. Countries tend to bond with countries with similar culture and balance against countries with which they lack similarity. Which is, I think, very obvious in the Western fraction. That is less obvious for the other parts of the world, but Western countries try to bond together by referring to a set of common communal values, which they call civilization. And of course, in this kind of building fractions and political power groups using civilizational values and concepts, there is a rise of inter-civilizational conflict. So Huntington prognosed for us that friendship and trust will be rare. Sadly, that is actually also precisely the situation of our world today. And but if we look deeper, we can find that Huntington's prognosis is not a necessity, which is not it is not a natural development of history. History is made by man, and man has ideologies and worldviews, Weltanschauung. So the worldviews is forming our actions and making us to make decisions which can again change the root of the world. So what is the problem of Huntington? I think that the problem is his Western-centric view of civilization. He is concerned about the decay of Western civilization, which was already a topic several decades ago with Oswald Spengler, a German writer. And he's also uneasy with multiculturalism. We can read very clearly in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. He is very uneasy with people who promote multiculturalism in the USA. So for him, multiculturalism at home threatens the United States and the West. Universalism, again, threatens the West and the world. So the problem is for Huntington that both multiculturalism and this universalism both deny the uniqueness of the West. That is in his words. And I have made a quote here, but I think maybe I will leave that later. I will leave it after because the time has been moving on. So my view is that Huntington has built his prognosis and analysis also on philosophical suppositions and also a certain kind of subjective worldview. And his worldview is a special kind of narrations for the Western civilization. And we can find also within the USA a critique of this version of narration. I found an article written by Roland Birkin, and in his article of 1992, What is Western Civilization? He has labeled also he says that this kind of narration of Western civilization is a kind of ideology and idealization because it stresses the metaphysical uniqueness of the West. I think that the metaphysical uniqueness of the West is what is not empirical, which is not scientifical, but that is what lies under the whole analysis and the prognosis of Huntington's The Clash of Cultures. So I think that the clash of cultures can be avoided. We have a way out of this clash of cultures, but we have to depart from this metaphysical uniqueness of the West. That is the way out for the world peace, actually. So we have actually within Western thinkers and intellectuals an alternative narration of Western civilization. And not only today, but also very earlier, very decades ago. For example, Bertrand Russell, he has visited Beijing and Shanghai in the 1920s. And in this book, The Problem of China, he departs from the 19th century Eurocentric view of history. And we have also Arnold Toynbee in his very large work, A Study of History. But I think that Russell is not very well read. Russell's book, The Problem of China, is not very much read today within Western circles. And neither is Toynbee read widely today in the among Western intellectuals. There is a famous talk made by Toynbee with a Japanese intellectual in 1972, and that is long before the Cold War was ending. However, Toynbee has already seen that Asian countries will have contributions to world peace. This book is edited and also published in China. I'm not sure whether it is translated into English. The Japanese philosopher is called Daisaku Ikeda. He is a prominent Japanese Buddhist philosopher, peace builder, and author. He's still alive as long as I'm informed. So another concept is Jaspers. He has written The Origin and the Goal of History. In this work, there is a very important concept which I think will be a large contribute to peace building in our actual contemporary world, which is the concept of the axial period, as many people already know about that. So I am going to talk about Jaspers. Jaspers, oh yeah, I will be quick. Jaspers has some central concepts: existence, transcendence, existence, transcendence, communication, which is in English, existence, transcendence, and communication. To summarize very quickly, transcendence is something which went beyond all the empirical formations. This is a being in itself and a metaphysical core of all our human existence, which is also transcultural because it is the core of humanity. So actually central and also the same to every human in the world. But this kind of transcendence is also the source of ethics and values. So ethics and values are not cultural dependent. Ethics and values come from our humanity. That is why we need communication. We will need love and communication for each other, because the quest for both knowledge and selfhood requires breaking from the shell of solitude and ideology to engage in the loving context in which individuals strive for openness and honesty in boundless communication. So I will be very quick because the time is running out. I will talk about this actual period. In this actual period, why is this actual period very important for us? That is because in philosophy came into being, and in this period, man becomes conscious of being as a whole, of himself and his limitations. Culture and other cultures, other civilizations, and otherness, these are also possibilities for us. For example, Western civilization is not something foreign to me. It is other to my culture, of course, but it is not foreign to me because it comes from the same metaphysical foundation and source, which is the being as a whole. So the Western civilization is also my possibility, and my civilization is also the possibility of Western people. And I think that this kind of view of civilization will contribute to a more peaceful interaction between states and human beings. So I will skip all these quotes and come to a Chinese intellectual, which is called Tan Yijie. The reason why I'm referring to Tan Yijie is because he revives Jasper's concept of actual period. He has introduced the concept of a new actual period, which is used very frequently in our medium today. We are actually promoting this value and this concept of the new actual period. But he is combining Jasper's concept with Confucian tradition. So maybe I will skip all these quotations and come to one central Confucian concept, which is Ren. And there is an ancient text which is excavated in 1993, and these bamboo slips. we can read from this ancient text explanation of the central Confucian concept of Ren, which is to love and love deeper. That is love, but to enlarge the love for one's father to the love for human being. That is Ren. So Tan Yijie used the central Confucian concept for building a new actual promoting and calling for a new actual era in which different cultures and civilizations can communicate and can build friendships with each other. Human beings can build a harmony with each other. He finds also allies in Habermas' theory and Gadamer's theory in their series of the principle of dialogue. So my time is running out, so maybe I just read a little bit of this quotation, and thereby I will end my presentation. Han Yijie's suggestion, and as a response to Huntington, is that differences in religious beliefs, values, and ways of thinking may lead to conflicts among nations and states, and the conflicts can breed wars. But these conflicts are not inevitable, as he says, because he asked, would it be possible that these conflicts be resolved peacefully without a war for cultural differences? We have to find a common resource of thinking in all national cultures and advocating the coexistence of civilizations in order to prevent any possible conflict or war. This is a little bit abstract, but my suggestion as a thinking in the same line of Tan Yijie, I will suggest that people from different cultures shall use their own cultural heritage to reflect on our common origin, our common humanity, and only with a deeper reflection, people can bond each other in a deeper emotion of love, respect, mutual respect. And only with this philosophical knowledge and reflection, we can live peacefully with each other. So that is my philosophical suggestion for the piece. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Lots of stuff to consider, but it's a super relevant to our topic, right? The conflict and hope. So I know Meredith has a question. It's over in chat, but if you'd like to unmute and ask it, we've got about 6 minutes.
Yeah, yes, I will. Maybe I have to go stop sharing my screen. Then
There you go.
Oh yeah, that is what you said. Is that my question? Aggregated.
Yes, I can go ahead and read it.
Oh yeah.
What if we say that civilizations are aggregated ethnicities, not nations, while nations aggregate to form empires instead of civilizations? Because I noticed that the 5 components of civilization did not list forms of government. So the governmental unification of nations may be an empire.
Civilizations are yeah, that is. I think. Of course, I have to think for.
Yeah, you might have to think on this for a while before you have an answer. That would be okay.
I think it is a sociological, highly relevant passion, but I have to understand it as a philosopher. So, empires, not civilizations. Is that a kind of suggestion? That is, we built empires instead of civilizations.
Well, or that an empire and a civilization are 2 different concepts.
Yes.
And you build an empire by government and you build a civilization by culture.
Yeah, and the question is, I see the question, but I'm not getting the point.
Well, I'm just wondering if in your talk, you did not use the word empire.
Oh, no.
and you did not use the word ethnicity.
Mhm.
And so I was wondering if you did try to integrate those two words into your analysis, would it adjust how you expressed what you're doing?
Into my analysis, yes, I think that if I think about Taco Parsons, by forming a kind of functioning society, we will need culture. So I don't think that the mere form of governance will suffice for holding the empire together. I don't think that will be a long-lasting empire, or the empire will have to suppress every different groups by force. So that is the Roman Empire. We see that the Roman Empire practiced that with a very strong military force. However, if you want to have a peaceful and a well functioning society, I think that the cultural factor is very important.
Yeah. Because the Roman Empire was pretty successful for quite a while.
Yeah, it is a long lasting. However, I think that their military is much stronger than we can imagine for any power today. I think in comparison to these tribes, of course.
I have a question. I have a question. If no one else does, you bring out with your slides this tension, right? That we distrust others, and we see others, or I guess there's this constant conflict that seems to be part of human nature. But then you end on this really hopeful note of coming together in this peaceful way. What's to motivate that? What's to help us? Is it the transcendence or something else that's supposed to help us learn about the other and come to accept the other as in community?
Yeah, thank you. I think it is a very good question. But I think that it is a kind of emotion that we people have to want peace, and people have to want to love each other. And maybe I'm not sure, but I think that this is a deep existential rooted existential wish rooted in everybody's heart. However, we have to find it because maybe we are living in this world with a lot of frustration. So we diverted from the very existential ground of our life, and we see only conflicts and hatred, and we sort conflicts. However, if we look deeper into ourselves, that is why I think that Karl Jaspers lead us to Socrates. He wants to look deeper into oneself. If we look deeper into our own heart, we will find this existential wish to bond with each other. And I think that love and friendship is a very important concept for German philosophers after the Second World War. We find that Erich Fromm and also Karl Jaspers and a lot of German immigrants have written on this topic.
I hope you're right. I think that would be really neat. I hope you're right. Well, it's 11:15. We're going to wrap up here. Meredith asked if there are some other thinkers in the Confucian tradition who might help to integrate Jaspers with Confucius. Maybe you could share those with the group if you have them.
Maybe there are also Mencius, who he has stressed as a sort of more universal love. So I think that, and the Mozi, they are also, it's not a Confucian tradition, but it is also an ancient Chinese tradition. And the Mozi is more comparable to Jesus' Christianity with this universal love. And Confucius stresses sometimes the love for relatives, for people who are near you. But of course, we can also make this love universal, as I quoted. I think that because even although Confucianism has been very prominent in the Chinese tradition, but we can find also a lot of plural resources and traditions in the Chinese culture, which can also integrate with Jasper's philosophy.